Um, Welcome everybody to the latest installment of the IBIS Environmental Justice Speaker Series. As a reminder, this is a bi-weekly speaker series that we're doing here at IBIS for the fall semester to really hear a breadth of perspectives and scholarship related to environmental justice. This is the fifth installment now of the series, and I'm really excited. You know, environmental justice, as we talk about it in the academy in the United States, is often very much focused on the United States, but we know that the environmental justice movement is in fact a global phenomenon, and that the challenges that we have with race, class, gendered inequality as it relates to the environment are certainly not particularly the United States. Which makes me all the more happy to have Dr. Deepti Chatti here to share some of her research as it relates to environmental justice. So Deepti Chatti, Dr. Chatti is an assistant professor of environmental studies and an affiliate faculty at the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University. Deepti is an interdisciplinary scholar of the environment whose research sits at the intersection of political ecology, environmental justice, feminist and post-colonial science and technology studies, energy geographies, and South Asian studies. Deepti's current work centers the politics of knowledge production in transnational environmental and development research. And for several years, she has been ethnographically studying a randomized control trial unfolding in 2 states in India that attempts to generate knowledge about poverty and climate change through field-based experiments. Deepti draws on her interdisciplinary training in the social sciences, humanities, natural sciences, and engineering to understand the sociocultural and political dimensions of global environmental change. Without further ado, I hope everyone can silently join me in welcoming Dr. Chatti here to share her research. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Miles, for that really kind introduction. And thank you all for having me here and for sharing your Friday afternoon with me. I have a talk prepared that I'm just going to jump right into it. And I have some slides to share. So I'm going to share my screen now, and then I'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. And I'm happy to continue the conversation as long as you want. So let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, great. Can you all see that? Okay, awesome. In addition to thanking Miles, I also want to once again thank Vanessa for organizing the Zoom link and for bringing us all together. So thank you all. In my talk today, I will be analyzing what environmental and social justice looks like from the vantage point of the kitchens of rural India, which are the sites of numerous sustainable energy development projects. For some reason, my slide is not moving. Okay, there we go. Okay. Environmental justice, as traditionally understood, teaches us to pay close attention to the differential exposures to environmental harms that are experienced by different social groups. An environmentally just approach works towards minimizing these differences in exposures and towards building a more just world where everybody can thrive. However, I argue that an equally important pillar of environmental justice is epistemic justice. That is, it is important not only to reduce exposures of harm, but also to listen to the priorities and perspectives of different social groups, and ensuring that the most marginalized amongst us also have a seat at the table in making environmental decisions. My research shows that sustainable development projects to improve energy access in the global south, even when well-intentioned, can propagate environmental and social injustice by not allowing for the plurality of epistemic frameworks and the multitude of priorities that are already entangled in the sites of development. While global energy experts are mired in debates about whether burning fossil fuels for the improved health of low-income families is environmentally just and developmentally sustainable, rural Indian women are making everyday energy decisions based on multiple other factors, including how to feed their families good food, how to make sure their children are healthy, and trying to lead materially and spiritually enriched lives. In doing so, my work brings together debates in environmental justice that are usually grounded in case studies in the global north, like Miles just mentioned, with debates about sustainable development that are usually grounded in the global south. I believe that learning about inequality and injustice from multiple places, sedimented with varied histories, allows us to build solidarities across differences. The talk that I'm giving today is part of a book project that I'm currently working on, based on research that I carried out between 2013 and 2019. This book is born out of my larger research program, which centers feminist and post-colonial approaches to understanding environmental and social justice issues in the global south. My book manuscript focuses on development efforts to improve clean cooking energy access to low-income families in rural India. These development efforts consist of promoting different kinds of improved cook stoves. So what do I mean by improved cook stoves? These cook stoves are an umbrella term that are used to describe numerous technologies that are efficient at combusting household cooking energy fuels. Some of these technologies use biomass fuels, solid fuels, and others use fossil fuels or electricity. I spent over 18 months conducting multi-sited and multi-scalar ethnographic research in India, moving from rural homes in the Western Indian Himalayas to the design and manufacturing facilities of improved cook stoves in urban locations, as shown on the map here. This is a political map of India. And I moved also to the plush offices of various international aid organizations in New Delhi, the capital, and the nondescript government and academic offices in various parts of India. Additionally, besides my work in India, I followed cook stoves to the international locations where they were imagined, designed, and studied, interviewing practitioners and academics in California, Oregon, Iowa, Colorado, North Carolina, Washington, and British Columbia. So overall, in addition to my rural ethnographic fieldwork, I conducted approximately 69 interviews with various development actors outside the kitchen. Some of these interviews were conducted in person at individual offices, homes, or coffee shops, or at conferences and workshops, and sometimes over Skype and telephone. And finally, since I'm most interested in the way that knowledge is produced in development research, I became a participant observer in a transnational cook stove research project for 4 years that was unfolding in 2 states in India. My overall research aims were to ethnographically understand the perspectives of multiple actors, both within and outside the kitchen. Development efforts in household energy are motivated by concerns about household air pollution. The problem of air pollution has received increasing attention in recent years. Worldwide, it is estimated that 9 out of 10 of us breathe polluted air. Air pollution causes 7 million deaths annually. And the way this works is that the fine particulate matter in smoke gets embedded in our lungs and cardiovascular systems, causing diseases such as high blood pressure, strokes, lung cancer, chronic and acute pulmonary disease, low birth weight in babies, and so on. And recent research has also shown that people exposed to air pollution in the long term have increased mortality when infected with coronavirus. A lot of attention has gone to air pollution in urban spaces, and probably many of us have encountered news headlines about Beijing or New Delhi's dirty air. And more recently, some of us here in California have experienced a lot of air pollution in the United States as well. Now, that kind of air pollution is called ambient air pollution. What I'm talking about today is indoor air pollution, which is smoke within enclosed home and kitchen spaces of the homes of low-income families all over the world. Household air pollution, as this is also called, is understood to be of grave health concern, causing roughly half the deaths, or approximately 3.8 million, from overall air pollution. Household air pollution is the smoke from cooking fires made of a mix of combustible materials, such as fuel wood, crop residue, and animal dung. The effects of household air pollution are felt most keenly in the global south, and particularly by low-income families who rely on solid fuels for their daily subsistence. In India alone, researchers estimate that 1 million premature deaths occur annually as a result of this issue. Many people have worked for several years on household air pollution. You might see some familiar faces here. And this group is loosely called the clean cooking energy community. And it's comprised of engineers, academic researchers, nonprofits, technology tinkerers, former Peace Corps volunteers, philanthropists, social enterprises, policymakers, and so on. What you see on the bottom left is actually a billboard at a petrol station in India talking about a national energy program that I'll be talking a little more about in the future. Now, this is not a homogeneous community by any means in terms of its composition, and nor is it homogeneous in terms of its ideas. I'm going to now share a short vignette to illustrate some of the key debates in the clean cooking energy sector today. The setting for this scene is an academic and practitioner workshop called Going Up in Smoke, Women's Health and the Environment at the University of Iowa in April 2017. And what we're about to see unfold is a fight, not a fist fight, but an academic disagreement between two professors, one in an engineering department and other in a public health department. Why should we get the poor addicted to dirty fossil fuels? Asked a participant during the Q&A session. He was responding to a presentation made by a leading academic expert on public health from UC Berkeley, who I will call Jack. Jack was advocating that low-income households in the global South transition to fossil fuels as their primary cooking fuel. But the participant who had asked this question thought of fossil fuels as a dangerous and addictive drug and did not want new addicts hooked onto it. I agree, chimed in another audience member and co-organizer of the workshop, who I will call Rohit, who was part of the engineering faculty at the University of Iowa. While I support the adoption of LPG, which is the fossil fuel or propane as it's called in the United States, while I support the adoption of LPG from the health perspective, Rohit said, I'm wary of getting people hooked onto a fossil fuel now in large numbers like you are advocating. That's the first concern, and thereby alluding to the growing environmental cost of fossil fuels. The second concern is that this fossil fuel in the Indian context is going to come from the US and maybe later from Ukraine, thereby alluding to geopolitical factors that made this energy transition undesirable for him. It comes from the Persian Gulf, actually, Jack, the Berkeley professor, interjected. Which is unstable politically, Rohit continued and threw up his hands. And now you have a large group of people newly hooked onto a fossil fuel. If it comes from fracked natural gas, that has its own set of environmental issues. I understand the health concerns, and I'm a big fan of solving that, but this is an even larger concern. Jack was not so easily convinced. He replied, LPG comes as a byproduct of natural gas production. Natural gas production is increasing dramatically, so LPG is coming anyway. But he conceded that there was merit in Rohit's underlying concern about burning fossil fuels. He continued, it's an interesting philosophical point. They flare it in Ukraine and Nigeria or send it to industry as a fuel. But I think that households are the highest value use for LPG. This exchange, although carried out in the polite and respectful tones of academic dialogue in a workshop, only lightly tinged with exasperation at the other's position, exemplified the divergent views within the clean cooking energy community. While all actors within this community aim to improve energy access for low-income households in the global South, what that improved energy infrastructure looks like differs in their opinions. One camp favors increasing access to fossil fuels so that everybody can quickly achieve health and developmental goals. Another camp wants to avoid fossil fuels at all costs because of their association with climate change. This debate has a long history, and cook stoves are not themselves a new phenomenon. Improved or clean biomass cook stoves have been the poster child for development projects for decades. In India alone, they have been part of the toolbox of development agencies for over 70 years. Until the 1950s, they were promulgated as a cure for rural drudgery. In the 1970s and 80s, they were supposed to solve deforestation or the so-called other energy crisis. In the 1990s, the focus shifted to health, and most recently to women's empowerment and global climate change. Whatever be the development issue of the day, cook stoves have been the technological solution of choice. What makes cook stoves such an enduring intervention for development organizations? Why are kitchens such a charismatic and potent site for imagined new environmental and social futures? What purchase does the word clean have on the imaginations of various development actors? Drawing on my multi-sited and multi-scalar research with rural Indian cooks, energy technology experts, public health professionals, and climate change researchers, I analyzed the contestations over what clean cooking energy technologies are and examine debates about which forms of development are sustainable for families in India. I contrast the technological anxieties of global energy experts that you see here on the top left with the everyday lived experiences of families in the Indian Himalayas that you see here on the right. The everyday cooking devices and methods of low-income families around the world are seen as causing multiple harms at various scales. To the individuals cooking and their families, these so-called traditional cook stoves are seen to cause harms in the form of adverse public health outcomes and inequitable gender relations. To the global community, so-called traditional cook stoves are seen as causing larger harms in the forms of hotspots of forest degradation and global climate change. This litany of harms is seen to arise from the smoke billowing out of these so-called traditional stoves, burning solid fuels, which result, as I mentioned earlier, in the release of particulate matter into the air, which when inhaled into human lungs deposits dark matter, causing much the same health effects as smoking or urban air pollution. And the smoke that does not get inhaled instead gets emitted into the atmosphere, trapping sunlight much like carbon dioxide does. Subsistence cooking in this way is seen as the way that the vast majority of the world causes global climate change. For all of these reasons, kitchens of low-income families in the global south are made the targets of modernist clean cooking energy projects. Low-income families are viewed both as victims of poverty and as perpetrators of climate change. Domestic kitchens are imagined as important sites for development interventions, simultaneously intending to build resilience in families across the global south and making them more sustainable and responsible global citizens. So these families are viewed both as actors subject to global forces out of their control, to which they need to become resilient, as well as agents, and agents that are able to sustain and make global change. But how do rural Indian women think about clean cooking energy? To answer this question, I turned to my research in the Kulu district of Himachal Pradesh, which is, as I mentioned earlier, in the Western Indian Himalayas, where I have a long-standing relationship with a community-based organization working on promoting clean cooking energy. My aim was to understand the priorities and epistemic frameworks of my rural interlocutors, who are the targets of these development projects. I would like to now introduce you to Jyoti, a fearless farmer who has almost single-handedly transformed her family's fortunes through her perseverance and grit at vegetable farming. As I tell you the following story in the form of an ethnographic vignette, in which I describe a morning routine for her, I encourage you to focus on the rhythms of Jyoti's life and the responsibilities that she has for providing food for her children and for her cow. Jyoti wakes up at 4 in the morning, and the first thing she does every day is milk her cow, who waits for her. After that, she heads to her fields to begin her day's work. As a farmer, livestock carer, and parent of 2 teenage boys, Jyoti's day is sculpted by the rhythms of daylight, rain, and the needs of her human and bovine family. The lush and fertile soil of the Kulu Valley nourishes her crops and provides Jyoti with her livelihood. But it also provides a fertile ground for weeds and grasses, which seem to shoot up overnight and cover her carefully planted seedlings. Their spread needs to be controlled every day, or they can get out of hand and smother Jyoti's delicate tomato plants. Jyoti unsentimentally uproots each weedy plant and collects them in her kilta, which is a tall basket made out of reeds, which can be worn kind of like a backpack as shown here. While they are an unwanted nuisance in her fields, the weeds are a fresh, delicious, and welcome meal for her cow. After removing every last offending interloper from her field, Jyoti turns to the common area surrounding her fields where tall grasses and bushes thrive. This is what her field would turn into if she didn't take care of it every day, she explained to me. She picks up her dhrat, or her sickle, that she brought with her and begins cutting the bushes and grass. After filling her basket with a variety of different wild plants, once in a while explaining to me that her cow likes the taste of this particular grass and that the leaves of another bush have medicinal properties that will help her cow with flatulence, Jyoti returns home around 7 a.m. She first stops at her livestock area and feeds her cow the fresh bounty of green biomass that she had just collected from her fields. Her cow grunts in joy at the care and affection conveyed by the green treats that Jyoti spent 2 hours gathering. Jyoti explains that although she fed her cow dried grass early in the morning, she always makes sure to also feed her wet biomass since her cow loves it, and the green biomass hydrates her and helps her produce more milk. As her cow continues to chew slowly, Jyoti neatens the livestock area. She gathers dried twigs and branches left over from yesterday's meal in one part and collects her cow's dung into a small basket kept here for that purpose. Then she picks up the dried twigs and branches and heads home. Jyoti's house is a multi-level structure made of an assortment of materials. It is what is known in this area as a lanta, a relatively new home structure made of cement and concrete, instead of the older houses made of wood, which is called a chodi. Every year that I've returned, it seems as if Jyoti's house has grown in height and girth. New rooms are added, new floors are laid down, a balcony is appended. A staircase replaces a wooden ladder to climb to the upper reaches of the house. A tap is installed so that water does not have to be carried in buckets, and so on. And so I've come to expect that every time I return, something is going to be different in the house. So now you have a sense for the way that Jyoti cares for her cow and the way that she embraces material improvements to her house. In the next part of the story, I'd like you to focus on the way that Jyoti cooks food that morning. To cook the morning meal, Jyoti lights a fire in the mud stove that's shown in the photograph here in her upstairs kitchen with the twigs that she just brought in from the livestock area. Today, she's making curry, a spiced gravy dish made with yogurt and soy chunks, a favorite dish of her son's. After seasoning the curry with coriander seeds and a few other spices, and seeing that the wok that it was cooking in was nestled at an optimum position in the mud stove, Jyoti adjusts a few twigs to get the heat intensity just right. While the curry merrily bubbles and thickens, Jyoti deftly uncovers a large tray of bhaturu batter that she had made the previous night. Bhaturu is a type of sourdough bread that is made especially in this particular region of the Himalayas. And as you can see here, it's really got a sort of sourdough batter consistency. After checking that the batter was ready to be shaped into little bhaturus and getting some bhaturus ready using dry flour and shaping the dough in her hands, Jyoti popped downstairs to her gas kitchen to put some rice and rajma, which are red kidney beans, to cook in her pressure cooker. She called out to me that she was making another round of tea for all of us, and soon enough brought 2 cups of steaming tea up to the mud stove kitchen, where I was sitting and taking notes about the cooking process and keeping an eye on the bubbling curry. I was familiar enough with this upstairs kitchen and its low slanted roof to know where and how to position my body in such a way to minimize the smoke that I would breathe in from the wood fire. After having read all of the epidemiological literature on the adverse effects of smoke, I tried to be as careful as possible to minimize my own exposure to it, while still enjoying the benefits of Jyoti's delicious food and continuing my research. It wasn't that hard to do on most days, as there were several gaps between the low walls of the upstairs kitchen and the asbestos roof, where one could find pockets of fresh air amidst the smoke. Jyoti was happy she was making bhaturus for her children and for me that morning on her mud stove. "Do you always make them on your mud stove?" I asked. "Yeah," she said. "They come out well. They taste really good." And they indeed taste really good, baked in the hot fire and lightly singed on the outside. Doesn't the smoke bother you? I asked her for the umpteenth time. It does sometimes, she said, like when the wood is wet, but mostly it's okay. The fire's good, it's pure, it's healthy to eat bhaturus made on it. In fact, when I make prasad or ritual offerings, I will only use the upstairs chulha or the mud stove. When Jyoti is thinking about cooking, she's thinking about her cow's food, the weeds that she needs to control in her fields, about how to make delicious bhaturus and kadhi, and she's balancing her use of LPG and biomass. She's thinking about her tomato crop and how much cash she will earn from her harvest this year. And she's preoccupied about keeping her deity happy to ensure that all of her life's activities go well. This entire gamut of concerns is not currently captured in the way that energy projects are conceptualized in Jyoti's kitchen. Jyoti's decisions about her cook stove technologies are not circumscribed by the walls of her kitchen. She actively manages the material and energy flows between her hearth, livestock area, and her fields. In the kitchens of Himachal Pradesh, different cook stove technologies are present and used every day. Some of these stove technologies are fashioned out of locally available mud and made by the people who will use them every day, like Jyoti. These so-called traditional cook stoves burn solid biomass in the form of wood, animal dung, crop residue, and in some cases, pine cones as well as fuel. Other technologies that families use are made elsewhere and use wood, liquefied petroleum gas, or electricity as fuels. There's a lot of seasonal variation in which stoves are used for which purpose, and in another section of my book, I evaluate how agrarian decisions affect the ability and interests of families to use different stove technologies. As we discussed earlier, for some development actors, clean means using an energy source that mitigates carbon emissions, like sustainably harvested fuel wood or crop residue. For other development actors, it means focusing on fuels that have the least adverse health impacts on rural Indian women, such as fossil fuels like liquefied petroleum gas that burn cleanly at the point of use in home kitchens. Yet others think that the only acceptable solution is to provide electricity generated from renewable sources like solar, wind, or hydropower. For some cooks like Jyoti, it means preparing food in ritually pure ways, using local stoves and fuels, however smoky they may be. For other cooks, like Jyoti's aunt, Deepa, it means embracing fossil fuels so that their vessels and walls are not blackened by smoke, and keeping a 3-stone fire outside their house for whenever they need it to make bhaturus. Caste hierarchies affect the way that families relate to energy technologies. Upper caste families, like Jyoti's and Deepa's shown here, have access to biomass from their fields and common areas. Lower caste families, on the other hand, like those of Leela and Mohan, face a long history of dispossession in this part of India and do not have easy access to land or to biomass. Leela's family has had to perform wage labor for survival and actually has more liquid income on a monthly basis with which she can purchase market-based fuels more easily than Jyoti's family, even though technically Jyoti's family is wealthier. Leela is less eager to make bhaturu on mud stoves. Leela finds it easier to purchase fossil fuels and embraces the arrival of LPG in her life also as a mark of status in her life. There are multiple ways of knowing about health and pollution that are already at play in Jyoti's and Leela's kitchens. Jyoti believes that eating fresh food made by her on any of her stoves is good for her health and the health of her children and her guests, and that eating the food made on a wood fire is the cleanest, as that fire is from a tree that she herself grew, rather than a bottle cylinder of funny-smelling gas that was purchased in a nearby town. Jyoti also believes that allowing a ritually polluted person, such as somebody from a lower caste like Leela or somebody menstruating, to enter her kitchens would be bad for her health, as her deity would punish her and make her fall sick. Additionally, Jyoti highly respects Meena, a woman who runs an NGO in a nearby town with whom Jyoti's had a relationship for over a decade. For a few years now, Meena has been promoting an improved variant of a type of stove that many families like Jyoti's use in the winters. This winter stove that's shown in the slide here is called a tandoor, and it's a metallic box with a chimney and serves the dual purposes of cooking and heating the room. As you can imagine, in the Himalayas, it gets really cold in the winters, and so we need space heating to survive the long winter. Meena has collaborated with some American and Canadian researchers who are studying air pollution and cookstove adoption in rural Indian kitchens. When this cookstove project comes into town, offering new stoves to Jyoti and her neighbors, even more different ways of thinking about clean, dirty, pure, and polluted come into interaction in Jyoti's kitchens and those of her neighbors. I foreground family kitchens as sites of analytical importance to understand how different ways of thinking about clean, dirty, pure, and polluted get entangled together. Ultimately, it is Jyoti and Leela who have to decide every morning on which stoves they'll make their tea, curry, and bhaturus. They have to decide whether they will refill their gas cylinders in town when they run out, and whether to retain their mud stoves when they renovate their homes. Researchers, NGOs, and other development workers may come and go, but ultimately unpacking these multiple entanglements embedded in energy decisions is an everyday task for Jyoti and Leela to negotiate. Recent scholarship on infrastructure has drawn our attention to the promise of modernity, development, progress, and freedom that infrastructures encapsulate. Central to their theorizing of infrastructure's promise is the idea of futurity and an imagination of what could be tomorrow rather than what is today. How do these vastly different ways of understanding clean cooking infrastructures help us unravel the imagined possible futures at stake? One set of development actors envisions a just and equitable future where low-income families rely on locally available biomass based on renewable energy to power their kitchens, whereas another set of actors imagines justice to connect these families to the same networks of global fossil fuel companies that you and I receive energy from. One set of actors believes that it is ethical and environmentally just to focus on minimizing the inequitable air pollution exposures to low-income families, who are predominantly women of color in the global South. Another set of actors believes that since it is these families who are most vulnerable to climate change, they too must mitigate their carbon emissions, however small they may be per capita. Just like there's heterogeneity amongst my development actors, there's heterogeneity amongst my rural interlocutors as well. Some of my rural interlocutors do not think of clean as the absence of smoke, and they certainly do not measure cleanliness in terms of concentrations of particulate matter. Some of them care deeply about ritual purity and pollution and think about clean and dirty in those terms. Others do care about their vessels and walls getting blackened, especially if they do not have a home structure that is capacious enough to allow them to burn wood fires without soot deposition. Some of my rural actors are keen to perform their advancing station in life by avoiding ways of living that remind them of difficult times of deprivation, such as burning wood fires. Others don't see wood fires as deprivation, they see them as integral to having a proper, healthy meal. In India, these competing visions were forced to confront one another with a new urgency with the launch of the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, a new national energy program that I showed you a hoarding for earlier, which is a flagship policy of the current government of India. What you see here is a poster that's in the arrivals baggage claim area of New Delhi Airport a few years ago when I landed. This program expands fossil fuel cooking energy access to families below the poverty line and was launched in May of 2016. In the last 4 years alone, 80 million new LPG connections have been given out to low-income families. Perhaps unsurprisingly, LPG connections are extremely popular amongst Indian families as they index an arrival of modernity, signified by the ease of turning on and off a fire to cook with. Indeed, as scholars in the energy humanities have reminded us, reliance on fossil fuels is perhaps one of the defining features of life in the modern world, and low-income families who are subjects of development are keen to share in this experience. The popularity of LPG throws into sharp contrast the deep unpopularity of improved biomass stoves, which, as we discussed earlier, have been the solution of choice to a variety of environmental and social issues in India for numerous years. As described by an anthropologist who studies cookstove programs in India, most cookstove initiatives assumed axiomatically that all locally made devices need to be improved, if not outright replaced, and tended to isolate the technology's emissions and wood consumption from its sociocultural role as the hearth of the home that exemplified gendered expertise and competence. In rural Himachal Pradesh, cooking with so-called traditional stoves is performed by many families, whether they have an LPG stove or not, and is seen as an act of love and care, cementing a close relationship with one's human and non-human family members. Here, fossil fuels are seen as additive and not substitutive of locally made cooking devices. Returning to the question of failure of multiple programs in the past to replace traditional stoves with improved stoves, I find it interesting to think about the unused improved stoves which are strewn in countless village homes in rural India after development projects have come and gone. While failure is certainly one way to describe a technology that is not used, I analyze why these projects and ideas have endured for decades despite obviously failing. What have they achieved and for whom to continue to have a life in the world of development? We can see the carcasses of improved biomass cookstoves as having achieved their purpose by simply lying there unused. I tried to ethnographically understand why so many people continued to work on improved biomass stoves over so many decades when they seemed to find very little interest from rural families who they were ostensibly trying to help. A leading stove designer in India explained to me, "We've invested all this time and energy into making stoves that meet lab standards, but cannot cook. Earlier, we used to make stoves for government agencies, and now we make stoves for donors. Those are the actors that buy stoves. We are still not making things for the end users." In conclusion, I return to the question that I opened with today. What can we learn about environmental and social justice from the vantage point of the kitchens of rural India? How does an ethnographic analysis of the different interpretations of clean cooking energy allow us to unpack the stakes and contestations within debates about modernity, technology, and environmental responsibility in the era of climate change? We see that while development actors who are outside the kitchen are in agreement that facilitating a clean energy transition is required for development interventions, what clean actually means and how clean must be delivered to the subjects of development is highly contested. Clean is a very nebulous term attributed with all kinds of virtues. It could mean fossil fuels or it could mean renewables. It could mean state-provided and subsidized energy technologies. It could also mean private enterprise-driven models of new experimental technologies. When we analyze the issue from inside the kitchen, from the vantage point of the subjects of these same development projects, very different topics seem to matter. Rural families in Himachal Pradesh care about leading healthy and good lives, but the goodness of those lives is not necessarily defined by the absence of so-called traditional stoves. Justice demands that we pay attention to the heterogeneity of exposures to environmental harms, and that we analyze how race, class, caste, gender, nationality, and post-colonial identity affects the way that we experience these harms. Justice also demands that we pay attention to the forms of knowledge that are valorized and the ways of knowing that are diminished. This has direct consequences for the objects that get to be considered clean, modern, and improved technologies, and at the very core raises fundamental questions about the nature of technological expertise. Household air pollution is an environmental justice issue because it disproportionately affects people of color who live in the global south. These are low-income families, and it also has a gender dimension to it as air pollution exposures are highest for women and children. However, as I've shown today, environmental and social justice concerns are not only about differential exposures to environmental harms, but are also epistemic concerns about whose priorities and values are considered central to development decisions. I argue that there is a vast disparity in the way that energy and development experts see household air pollution as a problem bounded in kitchen spaces in the global south, needing improved technologies for efficient combustion, and the way that my rural interlocutors make sense of their health and well-being and attempt to lead materially and spiritually rich lives. My analysis shows that this disparity in understanding the concerns, everyday realities, and ways of knowing of the other is indicative of the environmental and social injustice that can too often pervade well-intentioned sustainable development efforts. Thank you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Deepti, for such a rich talk. If you don't mind, could you unshare your screen just so that we can all come back together? Wow, there was so much there. We have a question from Jean, so let's actually start. And if anyone has any questions, you can either post it in the chat or, I'm all for, feel free to jump in. And I don't know if you could see your screen, Deepti, but we've had several claps. That was really a incredibly substantive talk. Really appreciate it. So Jean asks, are there any current projects that recognize the community who will use them and show potential for being accepted by that community?
Jean, that's such a great question. And one of the things that I've been struck by in my work with clean cook stove development actors is how eager they are to incorporate suggestions and feedbacks for improvement. When you saw that timeline that I showed you about the different problems that cook stoves are supposed to solve, each of those iterations is based on feedback from not only the communities that the stoves were supposed to help, but also from development critiques from additional scholars. So I think there are many cook stove technologies. The issue that I'm drawing attention to is the fact that imagining a technology, a stove technology, as being the sort of technological solution that'll solve a lot of complex environmental and social issues in itself is a fraught enterprise, because even if the stove burns something clean, the way that energy technologists typically approach a design problem is to draw a boundary around it and make a focused effort on improving that particular dimension. But what I'm showing is that stoves are actually part of very rich, complex, materially and spiritually lived lives. And so the very nature of technological design, I would argue, makes it very difficult for any even well-intentioned stove designers or organizations to actually create products that meet all of these requirements. That's not to say that individual technologies aren't popular for one particular reason, but the imagination that anything can come in and then remove the need for all other technologies that people are using, I think that's the main issue that I'm critiquing here.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go to B's question. For mud stove use, would improved chimney designs be of interest to the rural users in order to retain the religious aspects while keeping interior air quality high?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are actually, so the photographs that you saw today of the various kinds of stoves in use are from one particular region of India. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of variation in the kinds of stoves that people actually use. So what a traditional stove is not one thing. The cuisine of India is very different every few hundred kilometers, and the stoves, therefore, are also very different. The fuels are different. So in Karnataka, in the south of India, which is the second site in which I did a bunch of research, chimneys are actually a part of the traditional stove itself. And they are built into the hearth of the home that wick away air from the interior space of the home. And chimney design has been one way in which organizations and technology designers have attempted to intervene. While that effort continues, there's a whole turn within the clean cook stove energy community that all biomass is bad. So that as long as you're burning a solid fuel, maybe we get a few micrograms of less particulate matter, but that the really substantial health improvements only happen when biomass is done away with entirely. And that's because of the way the dose response curve works. So in order to see a significant health improvement, we have to get a really exponential decrease in the particulate matter. So that's the sort of understanding from the health perspective now. And therefore, chimney design, while some organizations are trying to do in certain locally areas, has not really picked up as the main focus of attention.
Great. I'm going to move to Emma's question. Is removal of traditional stoves from the home used as a metric of success for cook stove programs? If so, what alternative metrics would you propose?
That's such a great question, Emma. Absolutely, it is. And in fact, many of the academics and researchers that I work with talk about how we need to focus not only on the adoption of clean technologies, but the disadoption of dirty technologies, right, in their words. And there's this concept of an energy ladder that's often talked about in a sort of teleological way about the way that families should climb up the energy ladder to using more and more modern technologies. And what that means is that they're supposed to stop sitting on the lower rungs of the ladder, so stop using those technologies. In fact, if any of the research or development is funded by carbon finance projects, removal of the traditional stove becomes a condition upon which the carbon finance money is actually given to the organization doing the project. And that's because of the way that monitoring and evaluation is set up for carbon finance money. So yeah, absolutely. So in some projects, you actually see, as a precondition of being given a new cook stove technology, there'll be a demolition happening on the side because a lot of these cook stoves are built into the home. So a demolition in the kitchen of the mud stove, which is, as you can imagine, it's quite a dramatic way to start a project.
Great, thank you, Deepti. Another question from another Emma. You mentioned a third camp within the clean cook stoves movement of people who believe that clean equals electric, using renewable energy. How have you seen this third type of stove used in your research?
That's again a great question. Another Emma. There are certainly people who feel very strongly that electricity is the technology of the future. And I should preface by saying already in the place that I do my research in the Himalayas, people do have electric stoves that are part of the so-called traditional toolkit. So there's multiple stoves, as I was saying, people use. So there are the sort of coil-based resistance electric stoves that actually do go around, or the induction-based ones, single unit stoves. And they're also a part of cook stove research projects. So the only tricky thing, though, is, as you can imagine, you can't have a fire, right? So you can have a heating element. But for a lot of the kinds of foods that, for example, the bhaturu that you saw, or for any of the ritual practices that people need to do, fire is an integral part of that. So again, this goes back to a lot of families that I've encountered might be happy embracing a stove that works for them to cook a particular kind of dish, but they don't see why that has to mean that they have to stop using all the other things that they've already been using for a variety of dishes. And it's much like how you or I might buy a new toaster, but we won't throw out the microwave just because we did that, right? So yeah, absolutely. Electric stoves, I think in one set of the stove camp, they're certainly the most, so they're seen as a technology of the future.
Great, thanks. Deepti, I have a number of questions, but people keep asking questions, so I have to defer to everyone else. I don't mean that to discourage the questions. Keep the questions coming. These are great questions, but so I'm going to keep deferring to the chat. So B asks again, what do you feel is the most effective way to retain the ritual aspects while introducing cleaner technologies?
That's a great question. And there's some of this sort of tension in sort of my work as a critical ethnographer. In what I try to do is stay away from trying to propose too many solutions, because I'm trained in critique more than in proposing solutions. That said, I completely understand, a lot of the people that I work with are like, often ask me, you spend so much time in the field, tell us how we can do our work better. So I understand the desire, and I know it comes from a well-intentioned space. So I say that as a huge preface to the fact that I'm not really trained to make solutions. I'm trained to critique them. But I will say that perhaps one way that I think about it is to stop thinking about all-encompassing solutions to enormous, complicated, dynamic problems, and to think about placing priorities on the people who know how to live their lives already, and so sort of shifting the power dynamic from thinking of sort of an external expert who can make a solution and make your life better, thinking of it more in terms of what are people's priorities, and is there something that I can use my skill set for to enable them to lead their own lives better in the ways that they want to, right? I know that's kind of a vague answer, but that's what I'm comfortable telling you as an ethnographer.
I also want to note, Deepti also is an engineer, so you actually do have training in developing solutions. But I know I appreciate the ethnographic lens. Another question from Jean: has COVID affected views toward cook stoves, since respiratory problems are a symptom of the pandemic?
That's such a great question, Jean. And this is something that I've actually been thinking about. I don't have an answer to that yet because ever since COVID has happened, I haven't been able to do any field work in India because I've not been able to travel. But this is certainly something that I'm interested in, and I'm curious to know how the pandemic has changed so many things in people's lives. One is, of course, as you point out, views of smoke, views of respiratory problems. But I would imagine also COVID has probably changed people's livelihoods, and it's changed people's ability to sell their crops, and it's probably changed travel patterns. So there's probably a lot going on that I don't yet know, but I'm eager to find out, and I'm eager to be able to travel again to find out those answers.
Okay, I'm now finally going to ask one of my many questions. We know that adoption of new technologies or new infrastructures is not simply a product of one's relationship or orientation to their old technologies or infrastructures, but also their proximity to their orientation to the new. And so I'm wondering, for someone like Jyoti, I hope I'm saying her name right, obviously she appreciates her old dirty cook stove, or traditional cook stove, but I'm wondering if her I'm wondering if you could speak to what her proximity to or exposure to clean new cook stoves is, because I would imagine that that's key, central in her sort of antipathy towards adopting the new. And I'm wondering more broadly if you could speak both with regard to Jyoti, but in the rural communities you're studying, how do they experience and have proximity to people like Jyoti who like their traditional stove? What is their orientation to proximity to the new?
That's a great question, Miles. And actually, I've got a new project that I'm studying. Refills of LPG, right? So it's basically trying to understand. So the way that the LPG program works in India is that you have finite quantities, finite volumes of the gas that you purchase in a cylinder. And what's actually given out is your ability to refill that when that gets over. So my new project is actually trying to understand what are the sociocultural, geographic, and resource barriers that affect people's ability to get a refill of clean cooking energy if they want it. And as you alluded to, Miles, in the mountains, there are all kinds of physical barriers that prevent people from being able to go into town, which is down mountain, across tiny roads. Oftentimes people may or may not have transportation to make that journey. Many of the roads in these communities, certainly where Jyoti lives, get washed out in the monsoon, so they're only sort of available for part of the year. So one has to really plan for one's energy use throughout the year, and not assume that every month they can go to town to get what they need. So there's that. There's also the element of cost. It has to do with when people have liquid income in the year. So they're primarily an agrarian economy here. And so there's a sort of seasonality to when crops grow, when crops are harvested, and when marketing happens and when sale happens. And there's also a huge element of seasonality because in these areas, summers are really hot and winters are really cold. And so as you can imagine, the kinds of technologies that one needs to use, I guess it's kind of like the Northeast in some way, but the sorts of things that you use in the winter and the sorts of things that you use in the summer are obviously different. So thinking about all of that means that it's a much more nuanced perspective. It's not simply, do you like it or not, but it's also what particular use does it give to you at which point in your life, right? And that is sort of a big element of how people think about using their technologies. In other parts of India, for example, there are all kinds of other barriers. So one might think about one's sociocultural identity and how that relates to who gets to have the franchises for the petroleum-based products. And they're usually people who are wealthy and upper caste. And so a lot of families who might be Dalit or lower caste or tribal families don't actually even get a foot in the door to have a connection. So there's a whole landscape of reasons why somebody might have a heterogeneous attitude to continuing to use something. Absolutely.
Great, thanks, Deepti. We'll just take a few more questions. This is a good one from B. I noticed that Goti had an electrical outlet in her home. Is that common in the rural communities, and have many communities been introduced to solar energy or solar water heating?
Yeah, B, that's a good question and good observation skills there. So Jyoti does have some electricity in her home, and it's there for a few hours in the day. The electric connections, at least in this part of the Himalayas, are not ever present. So for example, it's very common, even in the town, in a nearby town, to not have electricity in the winter for several weeks at a time because, of snowfall. A tree has fallen on an electric pole, and that completely disrupts the electric flow of the grid. So they do have electric connections. One of the big worries, tying back to the person who asked about induction stoves, one of the big worries that a lot of the energy technologists have is that because the electric connections are so temporary and so sort of, what's the word? In Hindi, the word is jugaad, but like improvised grids, improvised wires, that it may not be safe to actually plug in a high use item like an induction stove that uses a significant more amount of energy than say a light bulb, right? So there's intermittent electricity access in this part. I would say that that's certainly not the case all over India, but this particular government who has started this LPG program has also embarked on a large electrification campaign. So I think it's a very dynamic situation with regards to electricity, but it's certainly nowhere near as ubiquitous as you might see in rural America, for example.
Great. Is there any, I know, like I said, I have a billion questions. I'm going to whittle them down to like one to close us out, unless anyone else has a question. B's wondering if microgrids are being used.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I didn't talk about solar or solar water heating. That's a good point. They are there in very small sort of experimental, ways. There's certainly, for example, scholars who study microgrids and solar power in rural India. Jonathan Balls, for example, who was at Oxford, studies solar power in Uttar Pradesh and studies the sort of off-brand people putting together solar panels in little shops and sort of rigging them into their own homes to provide, a bulb, a fan, and a charging outlet for their cell phone. So I would say that it's definitely not sort of ever omnipresent and super common, but you might see because there was a development project or a social enterprise that decided to work in like 3 villages that they might have some sort of grid.
Okay, great. I'm going to close this out. So many interesting things in your talk, and one thing that I really noted was how you reflected on how it's possible to strategically sort of avoid the smoke, and that was sort of also built into the architecture. That there was not, you weren't just breathing in plumes of smoke. And I'm wondering if this may be sort of a crazy question, but I'm wondering if the epidemiological data that you have, would it all suggest that those evasive capacities minimize or attenuate the negative impacts of breathing in of indoor air pollution? Is it not as acute, or are the health effects not as bad as you would think, given that kind of dexterity and the architecture?
That's a really great question, because I think that's a question that's on the tops of minds of many people who work on the exposure measurement side of smoke. So the sort of latest wave of technologies in this research field is actually to have personal exposure monitors. So it's like a little device that you have to wear, kind of like a size of a cell phone, and it's kind of, you strap it around your body. And research subjects are requested to wear that every day when they cook, and to sort of wear that throughout their day as they go about their daily life. And I think there's some data to suggest that that exposures are much more varied throughout the day, and that it's not a constant, because earlier forms of measurement, or rather stove emissions measurements, are made by placing a device on top of the stove, right? But as you're cooking, one's not always sort of constantly bending over the stove. So I think the answer is, it's to be decided. We still don't know, but that's certainly the sort of newest wave in stove emissions monitoring device. There's also a little thing called a SUMS, a stove use monitoring system. So there's all kinds of technology and gadgetry, which I'm really interested in and happy to chat with you more about. But things that sort of actually stick onto the little stove, and every 30 seconds send you like a little data point. So big data has come to the stove world, basically, and people are trying to figure out how to get very fine-tuned, fine-grained, and nuanced understandings of exposures, stove use, temperatures, and all kinds of things. So it's kind of like the new frontier of stove research that the engineers are doing.
Oh, interesting. So interesting. Deepti, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone for sticking around right before, Thanksgiving break. This was really fabulous. And I hope everyone can feel empowered to stay in touch with Dr. Chatti, note her research, look for a book coming out at some point. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Miles, and thanks to everybody for your fantastic questions. And I'm so happy to be sharing my work with you.
Take care. Bye, everyone.